The most powerful navy on Earth was stopped by 3/4 of a mile of water. In the spring of 1915, the British fleet, the fleet that ruled the oceans, sailed up to this strait, the Dardanelles, and turned back. A thread of water between Europe and Asia, at its narrowest, barely 3/4 of a mile across. The gateway from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and the road to a desperate Russia. Everyone remembers that Gallipoli failed. Almost no one can show you, on a map, exactly how or how close it came. By 1915, the war in the West had frozen solid. 2 lines of trenches from the Channel to the Swiss border, and neither side could move them. So a handful of men in London went looking for a back door, and their eyes fell on the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally in the East, and they believed the weak link. Knock the Ottomans out, and you could open a sea road through these straits to Russia, an ally bleeding white and running short of everything. The loudest voice for the plan was the young First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. But it was never one man's gamble. It was debated and approved by Britain's War Council. Churchill championed it. The government chose it. Yet if it failed, only one name would carry the blame. The first attempt was meant to be the masterstroke, the clean win that would crack the war open without a single soldier setting foot on land. Ships only. Through February and March, an Anglo-French fleet pounded the forts and pushed for the Narrows. What they didn't know was that a small Ottoman minelayer, the Nusret, had slipped out in the dark and laid a fresh line of mines, about 24 of them, along the Asian shore, exactly where the big ships turned to maneuver. On the 18th of March, the fleet steamed straight into them. The French battleship Bouvet struck a mine and capsized in under 2 minutes. Of more than 700 men aboard, barely 75 survived. Then the Irresistible, then the Ocean. 3 battleships gone in a single afternoon and more crippled. The Navy turned back. Men have argued ever since that they turned back too soon, but the Allies never came for the strait again. Instead, the War Council made its fatal choice: send in the army and hand the Ottomans 5 precious weeks to fortify the heights and wait. At dawn, on the 25th of April, the soldiers came. At Cape Helles, on the tip of the peninsula, British troops went ashore, and at one beach were cut down as they filed off a converted collier, wave after wave, into the same guns. The sea turned red around them. But it was further north that the campaign found its legend. The Australians and New Zealanders, the ANZACs, were put ashore in the wrong place, a mile north of their target, thanks to inaccurate charts and a confused approach in the dark. Instead of open ground, they faced near vertical cliffs. Above them, the Ottomans held the heights, and a then unknown colonel named Mustafa Kemal. He later recalled the order he gave his men that morning: "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die." They did, and the line held. Within days, both fronts had frozen into the very trench deadlock the whole campaign was meant to escape. For months, nothing moved but the dying. Men baked in the summer heat, buried friends between the trenches, and measured progress in yards, when they measured it at all. Disease did what the enemy could not. In August, the Allies threw the dice one last time. A fresh landing at Suvla Bay, to sweep around the flank and finally take the heights. The men got ashore against almost no resistance, and then waited on the beach while their commanders hesitated. By the time they moved, the Ottomans had sealed the gap. The high ground stayed Ottoman. The map barely changed again. By the end of the year, London accepted the truth. Gallipoli could not be won. But more than 100,000 men were still pinned on those beaches, and getting them off without the enemy noticing was its own impossible problem. So the Allies turned deception into an art. They thinned the lines a few men at a time. They kept the usual routines running. And they rigged rifles to fire on their own, water dripping from one tin into another until the weight pulled the trigger. Through the nights of December and into January, the armies simply vanished. When the Ottomans finally rushed the trenches, they found them empty. The only flawless operation of the entire Gallipoli campaign was leaving it. The reckoning came fast. Churchill was driven from the Admiralty, shunted aside, and resigned the government, leaving to command an infantry battalion in the trenches of France. He had been the plan's loudest voice. Now he carried almost all of its blame, though the choice had never been his alone. A council had gambled, and history wanted a single name for the wreckage. It took his, the same name that 25 years later would call a nation to stand alone. In 1940, the men he sent were remembered differently. Out of this defeat, Australia and New Zealand found something they would carry for a century. The 25th of April became ANZAC Day, the morning two young nations came of age. And the unknown colonel, who had ordered his men to die, would go on to win his country's independence and raise a republic from a fallen empire. Mustafa Kemal, Atatürk, a strait barely 3/4 of a mile wide at its narrowest that the mightiest navy on earth could not force, that cost 250,000 men on each side, and that neither ever forgot. But Gallipoli was only the beginning. The men who lived through it were shipped east, into a disaster the world has all but erased, the fall of Kut. That story is next. This has been Unwritten History.